Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that you're all busy this time of year with your summer projects and installs and updates and professional development and all of the back to school plans. We are going to be talking today about three things that are really critical and I think top of mind for you as you prepare for the next school season. We'll be talking about cybersecurity, student safety and well-being, student engagement and efficacy, all things that you're going to be thinking about over the summer and into this next school year. My name is Amy Bennett. I'm the Chief of Staff at Lightspeed Systems, but I'm really excited about the other three people on your screen, the panel of experts who are going to be sharing their experiences, their knowledge, and tips for all of you on those topics. I will let them introduce themselves, starting with you, Steve.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Langford. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the Beaverton School District in Beaverton, Oregon, where we serve about 40,000 students and their families. I'm also the board chair for the Consortium for School Networking, which is COSN, which is the National Professional Association.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Grosso, Director of Behavioral Health Services for Round Rock ISD, a school district with about 48,000 students outside of Austin, Texas. I oversee a team of social workers, our mental health centers, a variety of different programs impacting the mental well-being of students. I'm also on the National Chapter Leadership Council for American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and part of the Central Texas board here in the Austin area.
Thank you. Great to have you on again today, Amy. And Mike.
Hi, everyone. Mike Bauer. I work at Amazon Web Services within our education technology vertical, where we're supporting thousands and thousands of education technology companies that run on the AWS cloud worldwide. So we have hundreds of services that we allow our ed techs to use to build solutions and products like that, which Lightspeed uses in many other organizations around the world. And so I get to work on different programs that come to market to help our ed techs do better in the teaching and learning classrooms in the US and abroad.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's great to partner with you on all of that back-end work and educational opportunities like this for all of the schools that are out there. We also, in addition to those three panelists, want you to be part of the conversation. So use that question box in your GoToWebinar control panel to ask any questions as we go. We want to make sure that it's an interactive conversation here today. And we are recording this, so if you have to step away, if you want to share it, you will get a link to the recording after we're done. Let's jump in, starting on cybersecurity. I look at a lot of surveys of data from IT professionals and CIOs in school districts, and year after year, cybersecurity is at the top of the list of concerns. We see more about breaches and data privacy every month, every year. Steve, tell us a little bit about what schools can do to mitigate the risk of falling victim to one of those attacks.
Yeah, Amy, the COSN just released a leadership survey, and cybersecurity concerns were the top reported concern for school systems. And it's because that we're such an easy target. We're filled with student and staff personal information and data. We are filled with financial data, and we sometimes lack the resources to be able to secure them like private industry does. And so when we think about things we can do as school systems, there are some easy kind of low-hanging starting points. And you start, I think, if you're looking into this, you start with resources that are available, like MSISAC, which is the Multi-State Information Sharing Analysis Center, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, and CIS, the Center for Internet Security. I think if you're beginning this journey about how do we get better prepared, the first thing you can do is look at the resources that are available and start to see how maybe the school system can align with the recommendations from those agencies.
It seems like, I've been in ed tech for a long time, and I know several of you have too, that this didn't used to be a concern for school districts. Hackers were going elsewhere, but not targeting schools. What do you think has changed there?
Yeah, I think our world is changed in respect to, as I mentioned, we are an easy target, and the costs of initiating a breach or a scan are so cheap. And so it's that combination of we need to better protect our resources, and it is so easy for someone to launch an attack. I'll just give you a quick example. A couple of years ago, our first day of state testing, we had a denial of service attack that almost shut down our network. That was purchased by a couple of kids for $50.
Wow.
So that's how cheap and easy it is to launch an attack or a breach on a school system, not to mention the work of nation states, the cyber criminal organizations. It just gets more and more complex with larger organizations and more resources, but the entry point is so low that I think it's that combination.
This is maybe for you and Mike both, Steve. If a district does happen to fall victim to an attack or one of these bad actors, what should they do? What's the first response?
Mike,
No, I mean, so first of all, there's a whole list of there's short-term things you can do, there's long-term things you can do. Having insurance is key, right? And unfortunately, insurance now is also starting to get more expensive because kind of like house insurance, you have to get sprinklers installed and fire extinguisher and other things. If you don't have a good awareness of what your security systems look like, and even one of the other to Steve's point of low-hanging fruit is just get a risk assessment done of what does your system look like? What is your infrastructure? Do an audit of what companies you're working with from an ed tech perspective, and how well are they interoperating with each other? Because you don't want to be the victim of a victim, right? You want to know that those ed techs are doing right from a security and compliance and data interoperability, but not just data interoperability in the sense of let's just share all of our data. It's controlled and standardized data interoperability. And there are resources we can talk about later in regards to how to get some of that information. But I think you have to start with insurance. You have to engage, if you do get breached, engaging the authorities is very needed. Ensuring your leadership team has a mitigation plan, and even that they have a backbone to execute on that mitigation plan. What does that DR plan look like? Be communicative with parents and all the stakeholders involved. And you could also take this question and reverse it, what not to do. Don't go silent, number one. Don't just go into a cone. Don't think that one or two people at your district can solve this. You're going to need external help. And what that looks like the partnerships that you've made with not just insurance, but with your ed tech companies. Hopefully you've built those relationships, you have security protocols, and you can do that. So I don't want to rant too more. I have others that I could go into, but I'll give Steve some airtime here.
Well, yeah, I think everything you said, Mike, all that, and I think it is very important, like Mike said, districts should be exploring cybersecurity insurance if you don't have it. Just be aware, because we're currently going through this process right now to renew ours. It's getting harder to renew because insurance companies are starting to raise the floor of expectations. And that is a good thing for school systems because it results in better protections. It's a hard thing for school systems because it forces us to rethink processes. And in some cases, we have to start to align some financial resources. So if yes to everything Mike said, I think I've not had the experience yet, but sadly, I know too many people that have been through this. The one thing I would say is that, or add, is we have processes in school systems for dealing with emergency situations, and we go into emergency operations when there is a school crisis. There's a chain of command, there's communication protocols. We need to think about a cyber attack in the same manner. It is no different than any other crisis a school system might face, and that I think can help because it addresses what Mike mentioned, that we will have structured protocols that we will need to follow. We will have interactions with insurance companies, and most importantly, like Mike mentioned, we're going to have communication protocols so that we are ensuring we're communicating appropriately and clearly.
That's such a great point, Steve, about kind of the incident response plan as I would think about it. You know, something goes wrong. Do you shut off the laptop? Do you call somebody? What do you do? But before everyone joined us, we were talking about communication on this panel, and it seems like communicating that, letting users know what to do often and regularly and consistently is probably pretty important, because you're talking about students and teachers and staff and pretty widespread users across the district.
Yeah, information is definitely power, but information is also money. And I think one of the other, just like Steve said, there's a reason social media is what it is, right? I mean, a lot of people have seen The Social Dilemma, and we could go into all the crazy of, like, you are, since we don't pay for Facebook and we don't pay for some of these things, then you are the product, right? It's your data and your engagement that is being sold. And so if information has power, you can see why schools have become an obvious target, because like Steve said earlier, they are an easy target because the security hasn't been there. See, as sad as this is, one of the main transmission methods of data is still CSV files, right? And so, you know, someone that's working with a help desk support might just be sending a data file across an email thread that's easily packet sniffed and is a breach of data, and frankly, a breach of PII, if you want to look at it that way. And so there's got to be better. We have to be doing better to secure those sorts of, and train, you know, folks on what good data interoperability practice looks like. I mean, information is very much, yeah, go ahead, Amy, sorry.
No, we really saw a lot, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, working with customers for our web filter and our analytics products, that teachers really well-meaningly started downloading free software and figuring out how to engage their students remotely. And they were trying to keep the class going and engagement up and looking for tools to do that. But it opened up some cybersecurity and student data privacy risks, because they weren't going through those IT processes and the vendor assessments and the security vulnerability scans and all of that. So knowing what software is in use across your district, having a great list of that seems pretty foundational here too. And working with trusted vendors, people who have signed your DPAs and whatever those security measures are.
Being the non-tech person on the call, like, and just seeing, you know, how I help with mental health in our district, SEL, and just even thinking, you know, all the perfect storm that happened with COVID, and realizing that everyone was feeling desperate of how to help. And Amy, as you said, very well meaning teachers or other kind of staff looking for solutions and didn't know what to do. And, you know, I am so lost in the tech world. You know, we have a great IT department, and I love being able to partner with them because they know the things that I don't know. But realizing, does every school district have that? Does every, I think of our smaller rural districts, especially here in Texas, so many are rural, they don't have the funds to have the high-powered IT department like a bigger district would. And just realizing that the stress that's put on so much staff right now causes a desperation, and probably a lot of steps can easily get missed, not intentionally.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And we know that cyber criminals and hackers and attackers feed off of that and prey on that. And they know either late at night or when stress is going on or there's a pandemic, whatever it is, they will be more likely to hit you at a time when you're not thinking through all the steps and you're going to click the link or download the CSV, whatever it is. So the pandemic set that up for them really well. And yeah, no, I think this is a great time to shift a little into the next topic, because it does tie together, which is student safety and well-being. So that is in a little bit of a state of crisis and decline during the pandemic. Hackers took advantage of that. What are you seeing just in your district and in your other work, Amy, in terms of the state of student mental health and the trends around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Is it declining? Yes. Is it just because of the pandemic? No. Mental health has been declining for over a decade for our students. I think If we could say one good thing that happened from the pandemic is we, the adults, finally woke up and realized, yes, there is a mental health crisis. And I think that has been fantastic that we finally are realizing the supports that our students need. But the crisis didn't happen overnight. That anxiety levels of students have been rising. Even pre-pandemic, it was the #1 mental health concern for our students was anxiety, and suicide's still the second leading cause of death and has been for quite a while for our teenagers. And so I think it has been declining, and then you put in a pandemic where students are isolated, they don't have their normal routine and structure. And let's admit it too, we as the adults aren't doing well either. I think it's easy to sort of scapegoat our children and say, oh, all the problems are that. And it's not, we're the culture, we're creating the culture, which is feeding the mental health concerns of our students and causing instability and without structure. And so I think it's just sort of been this perfect storm that's happened. And sadly, our students are the ones that have really suffered.
I was thinking while you were talking, Amy, about the airplane rule of put your own mask on first before you help your children beside you or whatever it is, and thinking about teachers. And we're talking a lot about student well-being and mental health, but talk about teachers too. What can schools be doing, implementing to help teachers, to help students, to help teachers help students? It all ties together.
Right. And I think yes, as school systems, we are there for the students, absolutely 100%. But without support of teachers and realizing that their mental well-being is really important, we can't help students. I mean, it's even in our district, I was seeing so many referrals that were going to our social workers for our staff, and realizing that that could be an awkward situation for our staff to be talking to a social worker about a student and then being like, oh, hey, I'm struggling too. So we hired a staff social worker purely focused on our staff, because knowing they have struggled even more these last 2 years than they had previously. We've asked them to totally redefine the way in which they teach. They had to pivot. A lot of times they're a lightning rod right now. They get criticized from every direction. And let's be honest, schools are looked to be the one place to solve all of our society problems, right? Like we have to feed them, because we know that they need food. We clothe them. Now we're helping with their mental health, like everything. And I think just the pressure itself. And so what can we do? Helping for us as educators to realize what is in our lane and what's not in our lane, right? And I think when COVID happened, boundaries of school and work life and home life, they are just gone, right? We were teaching 24/7, we were redefining, and I really hope we can get back to a place where we can sort of say, okay, when I leave work, I do go home and I shouldn't be available 24/7 to any parent or any student. Like there has to be those guardrails. Otherwise, I don't see how teachers and staff can keep up. Like we have to find a balance here. And I think that is the administrators and stuff, we have to be the leaders in that work.
So for the most part, schools have reopened, students are back in class, but staff, teachers, employees, a lot of people held on to those pandemic habits. Is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely. And I don't think we've given anybody permission to go. And it maybe won't go back completely to how it is, like, yes, there's times we can do a webinar from home. I'm from home right now. I'm at home right now. But like, how do we put some boundaries up so that our staff can exhale and they can say, when you're time off, you really need to take time off. That when it's the weekend, you have to rejuvenate some. And so really, how do we fight for that and advocate for our teachers and all of our staff?
Can I ask a question, Amy? The whole put your own mask on before you help others. I love that. And I'm curious, one thing we saw was parent engagement just explode, right, with the pandemic. Speak on, tell Amy Grosso, how, in regards to parent engagement, how have you seen that sort of parents got so involved because they had to get involved. It was the pandemic. And now things are starting to move back into the office and parents may not be as engaged, but are you seeing any parallel there with mental health and parental engagement and communication?
You know, and I think it can go two ways, right? Like you have the parents like, okay, you're back at school, I don't have to worry about it. But then I think we also had parents that were used to being able to be involved in every little aspect of their child's life. And now they're expecting that same communication back and forth to our with our teachers, and that's a heavy burden for a teacher, right? Let me tell you every little thing that they're for our students. There has to be some autonomy when they go to school. That's part of development. That's part, we know, of healthy, that they do things on their own. Like I even did workshops when parents were home with their kids, like let them be on their lessons by themselves. You do not need to be over there interfering. And so, you know, that does impact our students' well-being, because we know students need to feel like they can do things on their own. And if we're hovering the whole time as a parent, which is hard, I have an 8-year-old, it is hard to be like, oh, you're going to get that math problem wrong. Like, you know,
Let them fail. Let them
yeah,
fail. Yeah.
yeah, it's very well meaning intention. But I think sometimes the parent engagement that we see is more, I need to tell you how to do your job as an educator instead of let me support you as an educator. And those are two really vastly different things. And I'm not saying you don't advocate for your child, but um, teachers are trained educators. They have, it's a craft. They have worked on it, and there has to be some trust there as we're letting our students go back to school.
It's an interesting balance where, for all the things we're talking about, for especially the student mental health and well-being parts, parents are critical to that conversation, to the solutions, to all of that. But it is not necessarily by hovering over the math problem, as Amy says. And Steve, I want to pull you in here because we're talking about parents, and I'm a parent of students at Beaverton. So I see a lot of the things that the district has done from, I think it happened during the pandemic, turning on the weekly reports where parents can see what their students are doing, but also just education that you guys push out to parents on, maybe it's drug use and how to spot that, or mental health, or student safety, other things. So talk about how you at the district or through your work elsewhere think about incorporating parents into this topic.
Yeah, that always, knowing you're a parent in the district always makes me a little nervous on this webinar.
That's why I wait till the middle to remind you.
But no, I think in our last conversation, we were talking about how important communication is and how important the connection between structures and communication is. So to Amy, to your point earlier, that we do need to have those guardrails. I love that phrase. And we shouldn't tell teachers, figure that out, right? That's where we can put some structures in place that say, here's how collectively we're going to engage with families. And when we do that with teachers and with parents, then we create that common understanding. So it minimizes the people feeling like, well, I need to be more involved, or I don't have what I need. And so for us, what that looked like is we did sit down and say, okay, how do we design a system of communication? And sadly, to your point about the communications around drug and suicide, this year we've seen just such a drastic increase in some really tragic events. And so for us, it was a way, that was, how do we provide that information to families so that they're aware? And it's not us reacting, but trying to be proactive around involving parents, and then also setting what that looks like, so that we, again, to Amy's point, we're relieving some of this just work that just piled on top of teachers during the last 2 years.
And one of the things Amy and I talk about often, especially you're talking about suicide, is dispelling some myths. So you can't assume parents know how to have that conversation, right? It is a hard conversation, and across the board, people have misconceptions about, oh, just don't talk about it, don't give them ideas, things like that. So giving them the information, educating them as you're educating your staff and students seems really important. Amy, you're nodding. Build on what I said.
No, it's absolutely the truth. I think sometimes, in my role, I can get a little bit judgmental of like, why don't you, in realizing my husband reminds me all the time that most people don't sit around and talk about suicide and mental health and read articles ad nauseum, like that's not common. And just because that's my world. But really having that empathetic understanding from a parent's perspective. I'm from a generation, I think all of us are, that we didn't talk about mental health. We didn't talk about suicide. It was swept under the rug. It was not open at all. And that's clashing with the generation. Our students are not afraid to talk about mental health if they're struggling, suicide and those type of things, but the adults are. So we have this off balance kind of thing. So how do we provide education opportunities for our families? That was one of my biggest things when COVID hit, was to start doing some short little webinars, or even we would do Facebook Live, different things to get parents the information. Because I'll be honest, if I hold a parent session on suicide, I'm going to have a handful of parents come, and it's because they're already aware of the topic and they're supportive. And so really trying to figure out how we can make that information digestible for families and easy for them to access. Online, if it's a video online, it's very easy for them to access. They don't feel like, oh, I'm going to this presentation, everybody's going to judge me, kind of thing. They can do it in the comfort of their home. And how do we give them tips? And how do we give them tips, not just to talk about suicide, but way early before then? I mean, one of the biggest things I always ask parents is, do you ask about feelings and emotions as much as you ask about grades? Or how many points you scored in the game? And it's a stark, I have to remind myself all the time. So I think even providing parents that different framework to start thinking of can be really, really helpful in realizing we all have mental health. It was interesting. I read a report the other day that they asked people, what do you think of when you hear the word mental health? A majority of people started naming diagnoses like depression, anxiety, all of these things. They thought of it they thought of the mental health condition part, not just mental health. Like each of us have it, and it fluctuates of being better, and then we sort of go towards, maybe we're just sort of coping with it, but realizing it's a conversation we can have in not a scary way.
So again, putting on the masks of the parents and the teachers and the counselors and all the people surrounding a student and educating them will help them have these conversations earlier. So we're not getting to points of tragedies. But one of the things that we at Lightspeed look at, and I know you all think about, is how much of a student's life is online, and how some monitoring can help spot those things. And we're always looking at the earlier stages of bullying or abuse or depression, or like those things, before it gets to preventing a tragedy. So Amy, talk a little about how you incorporate some of those online monitoring things into how you identify students at risk, because I think that's part of what we're all trying to do, is like pick up on any signs that we can before something happens.
Well, I think that's why the online monitoring can be really effective, is it picks up students who maybe they're not showing the traditional signs or symptoms we look out for, because maybe in my mind that's very stereotypical, like, okay, they're not crying and all these things, but do I pick up little signs and symptoms in something they have written, or that they didn't even know anybody would read? And I think that's where it can be really helpful. And the monitoring is great, but then what's your plan after the monitoring? Right. And who's the one having that conversation, and how is that conversation handled? And that's where I think, communication keeps being this theme in the webinar today, that's the critical point, is the communication and how we deliver that to the student. Not that you're in trouble, not that you did something wrong, but from a place of caring and compassion, and giving them permission that it's okay if they're not okay. And then what does help look like for them? And so I think, I think there's times that students are thankful that somebody picked up on something that they didn't know anybody would even pay attention to. And I think for students that can be freeing. So many times we tell students, well, if you're struggling, ask for help. We act like that's really easy. That is hard. It is so hard, and we sort of minimize how hard that is. So I think sometimes being able to, we're the ones as the adults initiating that conversation, can be freeing for a student.
Well, and I know from previous conversations with you and all you've taught me about suicide prevention, that people often leave signs. They want to be stopped. And what we see with our solutions and our alert product in particular is that even students who know they're being monitored are maybe intentionally raising flags, right? They're not going to walk into the counselor's office because it's hard, but they will write something hoping that someone reaches out to them. And it's just a different version of the same thing. Students communicate online, and that's a part of it. But you talked about education and how you have those conversations, and that seems really important here too, because you know, we're monitoring for students at risk, and when something looks imminent or troubling, we contact the district. And it has often come up like to go straight to the parents or things like that. One of the important things I think about talking to the district, the counselors or the student services professionals, is they are trained to have that conversation with the student or the parent, where the parent is not, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was just presenting with a coordinator I work with on suicide prevention, and she was even talking about one time calling a parent because the kid had made an outcry and just, she was like, okay, this is what your student said, and these are the resources. And the parent had to remind her, just saying, I heard nothing after you said my son said he wanted to die.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those of being able to have care and compassion for the families in that moment too, because in that moment, even though it's a little bit of a crisis moment, you're having to educate the parent of what it means and then what supports there are and how we're going to walk you through it and how you're not alone. So that's not only is the student not alone, but the family's not alone. If you've never navigated the mental health care system, it is not easy. Resources are scarce. We still don't have enough. And so I think how, like you said, somebody who's trained in that to be able to be the one reaching out to the families to offer the support and really walk them through what that looks like.
Yeah, so important. And, I didn't even try this, but it seems to really be happening that we're segueing into our next topics really well, because our next topic is engagement and efficacy. And this idea of student engagement, it ties to their mental health. It ties to their parental involvement. It ties to their feelings of safety. All of these things really tie together. So I'll jump here to you, Steve. How do you look at student engagement and efficacy of your interactions with them at Beaverton or elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a complex question, I think, because it changed so much. There's kind of the before COVID experience where we thought, and then there was remote learning, and now we're back into in person. And it is a complex question because I think it looks just so different. We struggled this year with student engagement. We struggled in remote learning because students would, it happened, I'm sure, at all districts, personal friends of ours, their students would just turn off the cameras, lay on the bed and listen, right? Because of what they were going through, the enormity of living in a pandemic. And then coming back to school and having to figure out again how to do school. And especially if you're in those transition grades where you, before pandemic, might have been finishing elementary, and now all of a sudden you're close to finishing middle school and never set foot in the school. So, for us, that engagement piece, it just shifted so much. And then to try and tie that to efficacy is a challenge, is, just honestly a challenge for us.
If you think about the technology or strategies putting into place to help with engagement, one of the things we look at, and I know Beaverton uses this, is classroom management. The idea being, again, like help the teachers, help the students. And a theme that really came out, we just keep going back to the COVID years, but a theme that really came out is this lack of visibility. Their cameras off, like you said, Steve, we don't know what they're doing. But the same extends when they're sitting in the classroom, right? They're behind a screen or they're typing or whatever it is. So how do you help teachers bridge that gap and empower them to drive engagement?
Yeah, we have been using the Lightspeed Classroom for a long time, and it was, I'd say, before the pandemic, we had some teachers who really found it to be a useful tool. And then when we went remote, everyone went, oh my gosh, this is so important to be able to just see. And it's very different than, you know, when we think of monitoring, there's also all kinds of student data privacy concerns. And so we got to be very clear, you know, we have very tight structures in place around the ability for people to see what students are doing to protect their privacy. And also, though, we've got to balance that with exactly what you said. We need to be able to understand engagement. We need to be able to understand when students maybe need some help and intervention. And so for us, that really helped us during the pandemic. And what was interesting is now that we're back, we didn't see a return to pre-pandemic. Teachers are like, this is a very useful tool. This is one way that I can just make sure my students are staying on task with me. And so for us, you know, that it really hit the sweet spot in the way we've used it between kind of balancing the student data privacy concerns that we heard from parents and we also hold dear, and then also giving teachers a powerful tool to be able to help students maybe who need it.
It's really interesting that use has not declined back to pre-pandemic levels, even though they're sitting in the classroom, and really mirrors in my mind. We bought a bunch of devices during the pandemic. We had to get to one-to-one. Now we have them. Now we've seen the power of them, maybe where we didn't before, of the technology and tools within them. So now it's about learning to use that in the PC world. Yeah. Amy, sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, because I just think, and I think what Steve said was key, that it's a tool, right? It is not everything. And I think that was what was hard when we were learning from home and stuff, that technology became the only avenue, right? It was the only avenue, and we saw that student engagement went down. But when it's just one tool, then we get the student engagement. And, you know, even saying like, how did teachers back, it made me think they did a story on one of our teachers, and he's been a high school teacher for like forever. Like I have staff that had him, that had, you know, like he's been there forever, and an English teacher. And he tells a story that it was after the pandemic, the next year he's at the grocery store and he recognizes the voice of the person that the checking him out. And it crushed his heart because he later realized it was a student that he had had the year before. But he didn't even recognize her because the video, the disconnect, and it broke his heart because his favorite part of teaching is that engagement with students. And he knows how critical that is. And so I think even for our teachers, for their own well-being, their favorite part is that engagement and getting their students engaged in the lessons, and that, you know, that they see technology as a tool, but it's not the only part of their craft. It's so many more things too.
Yeah, for all of these things, we talk about kind of a toolkit. It is one tool in a toolkit, and that toolkit includes a lot of things that are not technology based, right? Mm-hmm. Mike, how do you in your work with districts, like what are some tips you give schools as they're grappling with this engagement issue or efficacy issue?
I think, I mean, the tips we give are you know, back to because we're still 2 steps removed in the role that we play. Often districts are buyers more than builders of a lot of the technology, and that's by necessity because of budgets, because of technical expertise. And so we try and enable education technology companies like Lightspeed to be those trusted technical advisors that can be a bought solution, like by a Beaverton, you know, to implement and use engaged tools. And so underneath Lightspeed are a lot of the Amazon Web Services that are being used to deliver value, right? From all the monitoring that takes place with Lightspeed Classroom, and we are always trying to be a consultant to Lightspeed and to other ed techs to understand the trends, the budget needs, the cost needs. And fortunately for us, ed techs sit in public sector within our organization, and therefore we're able to pass significant discounts, but that's all, just sort of business sense. From a trend standpoint, the usage that we are always focused on is life and death to begin with. Like there's nothing, for me, back in the day, it was, I've been in ed tech for 20 years. And when I was at the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, where I was investing grant dollars into, real grant dollars into both ed techs, but mostly school districts to implement more better interoperable systems, we saw social emotional learning become interesting, very interesting, but not critical. And here we are watching the suicide ideation and watching like watching what happens with the pandemic. We're just like, we should have focused on social emotional learning 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, because that's the life and death that we're seeing now. And so, yes, we need alerts to be sent fast. We need monitoring to be available. We need parents to be engaged. We need students to be, we need to know. As a parent of 4 daughters myself, like I have 4 daughters, 13, 11, 10, and 5. And if you think that I'm not wanting every single notification when there's something that pops up that looks a little odd, absolutely critical. And so the more, give me the artificial intelligence tools that are going to be able to discern if there's a risk or not, and let someone engage face to face, right? Pick up the phone, call me, as a parent, me putting on my parent hat. And that's what I want, those engagement metrics to be known in a way that I can understand where on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is this issue, right? Don't talk to me about academics until I know that my daughters are safe, right? I think that's a huge need. I think the efficacy of just student outcomes pales in comparison, again, to life and death, but it is very important to understand, I'm talking to more, even just socially, other parent friends of mine, they're like, we're going to hold our child back, because of the pandemic year. Learning outcomes weren't what they needed to be. 5th grade, they were like, we're going to do 5th grade one more time. We just want to make sure that those learnings, that some use the polarizing term learning loss, right, it is taken care of. And so there's just lots of, I think, mitigation tactics that are happening right now around engagement and how it links to student outcomes. But anyway, hopefully that helps in some of the strategies that we're implementing.
It really does. And Amy, I saw you nodding when Mike was talking about social emotional learning and if we could go back 5 years ago, how do you look at that now? What is the thing we need to focus on today so that in 5 years we're not like, oh, we shoulda, woulda?
Yeah, absolutely. I loved when you said that, because it is, right? Like, how do we prevent things from happening? We get, right now, I just feel like we're in crisis mode and we're responding instead of, the action before. So even for my team, we always look at it like we do prevention work, we do ongoing support, we do crisis work, and then we do postvention. But we have to start realizing that we have to spend our time, even though we're helping some crisis, we can't forget the prevention part, right? Because that's still impactful. There's this parable about that a man sees someone in the river drowning, so he jumps in to save him, and then somebody else is in the river, so he just, other people are helping save everybody because they're all in the river. And at some point he's like, I need to go up the river and see who's throwing all these people in. And I mean, that's what we're doing right now with mental health. We're just pulling people out, and we have to go up to the river and say, what are we doing? There's a great quote talking about, we keep talking about the culture that's causing so much anxiety in students, and when are we as the adults going to realize we're the culture?
Wow.
And I just think that's for all of us, right? Like, all of us impact the culture that's what's happening to our students. So yes, we keep responding to crisis and alerts, but we cannot lose sight of those preventative aspects and SEL curriculum and teaching kids coping strategies and really helping them be complete whole individuals, because we know they're not going to be able to do well academically if this other doesn't happen. Like we keep forgetting it though, right? Because now all we hear about is learning loss from a year, and I'm like, whoa, can we worry about what else emotionally happened? Like, they were scared. We were all scared. Like, we got to acknowledge that and process through it.
And there's
it's not as easy to just move on and go back to normal, as some people say. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was struck with what Amy said. This is not an issue that is a one and done thing where we can say, oh, we've got a problem, we've got the steps to fix it, and we're going to fix it, and now we're fixed. And we learned that because last year we we did our largest summer school ever. It was about 10 times a normal summer school. And the focus was on SEL. And that was just to get kids ready. And then what we learned was, oh my gosh, that summer school, that was the beginning of our, of just keeping our foot on the gas about this. Because even after, you know, a summer school's great, kids got a wonderful experience. Hopefully we did some really good things with them. And we still have to be doing that. That becomes so important because, like Mike said, if they're not in that space to learn, we're wasting our time than focusing on academics.
Yeah, and back to the communication theme, you can't do it for the summer and you're done with SEL, right? Like you have to keep sharing those messages and keep checking in and keep those lines open ongoing. Steve, one of the things we were talking about before everyone came in was equity, and it seems like this really ties into that, this opportunity for some students to slip through some of these cracks. Tell us a little about how you look at equity.
Yeah, you know, when the pandemic happened, and I can't wait till we stop saying that, but when the pandemic happened, right, our focus was students have to learn at home. Do they have what they need? And we focused on things, and those things were hotspots for connectivity. They were devices. Unfortunately, in Beaverton, we've got a hugely supportive community. We were almost one-to-one. So our journey looked very different than other districts. And then we came back, but that engagement and efficacy piece, we can't forget that it's not constrained to the four walls of a classroom and the hours on a clock of a school day. And so students are learning all the time. If anything, our analytics are telling us they are online always, and they are, you know, sure, kids are playing games. They're kids. That's wonderful. My kids did, but they're also using the devices for learning. So learning now is an anytime, anywhere activity, and that creates an equity issue because some students can and some students can't. And so, and some schools, what we're starting to look at now is the student experience. The use of digital tools, is it this common experience between schools? Maybe a school where there's a high degree of families in poverty, experiencing poverty, versus one that maybe doesn't have that. And so for us, that's what we're starting to unpack in our, you know, trying to connect efficacy and engagement and equity. And what we're learning is we can't leave equity out of that conversation.
As we get to the end of our time here today, it strikes me that one of the things we're just always talking about and reminding each other of at Lightspeed is these staff, the IT staff, the teachers, the students, everyone in schools is busy, is dealing with a lot, does not have enough time, is wearing too many hats. So it's, how do you make it easier? How do you simplify what they're doing? We today have spent the last 50 minutes talking about big, important topics to make sure that that is not overwhelming. Like, oh no, now I have to worry about more things. To all of our listeners here today, let's leave them with a bit of advice. What's the one message or takeaway or thing to do as they walk out of here and have their summer ahead of them? And Amy and Steve, I'll let you think about it by putting Mike on the spot first to give his one bit of advice.
I mean, I think if I've learned anything from this conversation, it's work backwards from safety, right? And give our kids, the kids, you know, of the U.S. education system a chance to be in a safe place. Use the tools that can be used, that are safe and secure tools. Set your district's infrastructure up for success by, you know, risk assessment, you know, and implement multi-factor authentication. You know, don't be silly about data. You know, sending data all around like it's candy. You know, just being wise. Work backwards from safety. It would probably be the biggest thing, and we can help. I know Beaver, you know, folks at COSN can help. Lightspeed can help. I mean, we got a lot of folks that are directionally aligned to do the next right thing. I'm excited to see kind of what the next year is going to look like. And I will say one other thing, face-to-face is so important. And you know, I was with my colleagues this week. We were doing some things in Chicago, and we were talking about how there's been some companies that are like remote first. But when you're face to face, and I can't even fathom a teacher not being face to face with their students at this point in time, it is so critical. And I know this engagement right here is fine, but it's not face to face. Let's be real. And there's a connectivity there that's human. And I think a remote first strategy only goes so far. We need to be face to face. We need to be there. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, let's go to you to build on that. What's your advice?
Sure. Well, for cybersecurity, multi-factor is the most important thing you can do. And if you have not done it, you have to do it, and you have to do it quickly. We had 2 billion scans against our systems from outside the country in the last 6 months, billion with a B. And so you've got to protect your accounts. In terms of things you can do to help teachers, and I'm just resonating with what Amy was talking about with the impact of teachers and families of this and students. One thing we did that I would offer as a piece of advice was when we saw the explosion of EdTech tools, it created confusion amongst parents and students. It created stress on teachers because they were trying to find the solutions. And what we did was we built a system working with teaching and learning and said, teachers, here's your toolbox. Here's the tools you're going to use to communicate. Here's how often you're going to communicate. And we are going to standardize that so that you're not feeling like you're having to build your own and it looks very different from the teacher next to you. And then parents are saying, why aren't you doing it like Mrs. Jones? So if your district hasn't done that, you've got to sit down and you've got to invest the time and energy to build that system to take things intentionally off of the plates of teachers and also standardize that communication to parents so parents understand and can lean into that.
Such great advice, and something that became essential when parents were all at home trying to help their students with their Zoom classes, but that is just as important today is simplifying their lives. Amy, I'll let you share your advice now.
You know, I always think that it can seem overwhelming when we talk about mental health, and like some districts don't have the resources to have a person specifically just for mental health separate from school counseling. And I always tell people that if you do anything, it's better than doing nothing. And so you don't have like just being cognizant of the mental health of our students and staff is doing something. Focusing on that, we know a protective factor for suicide is feeling like you're safe and supported. And do we realize that our teachers creating a safe and supportive classroom is saving lives? And so don't think it's always the big work, it's the little work that actually saves lives. Yes, crisis response is important, but it's the little things that do make a gigantic impact.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be all imperfect. Every little step has an impact when it comes to saving students and protecting students. I will add my own tip here, and it really just resonates from what Mike said, which is don't feel like you're alone. You have experts out there on LinkedIn and in CoSN and in other neighboring school districts who are sharing similar problems. So sharing advice and working together and being part of those groups, relying on partners like AWS and Lightspeed who have seen it all and are here to help in a lot of these things. And yeah, just keep working together and learning.